Hi, this is episode 5 of the Seeking Ignorance podcast, my personal project to overcome unconscious ignorance. In this episode, I've got Professor Mfecane, who is the head of department. Why do I keep mispronouncing this? Professor Mfecane, who is the head of department at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of the Western Cape. He's an anthropologist, and his primary and current research focus is on masculinity. And I really wanted to talk to him because I read a booklet he put out on knowing men, which is an exposition into what it means to be a man in today's Africa. And I really, for a very long time, I've been concerned and worried about some of the things I see around. It seems like we're adrift, we don't know ourselves. Reading that book, I remembered what Professor Chinua Achebe, of blessed memory, said in the introduction to his book. What was the book again? Things Fall Apart. He said, Things Fall Apart, and that was taken from the beautiful poem by W.B. Yeats, Things Fall Apart, turning around a never-widening gyre, that poem, it talks about, he said, things have fallen apart, the center can no longer hold, we don't know ourselves. So I've always had this feeling for, the last couple of years or more, where I felt like we don't really understand ourselves as what it means to be a man or a person in Africa. We've lost our identity for a very long time. I've come to this realization over the last couple of years. And so it was very interesting to me to speak to Professor Sakumzi about this. I really wanted to get to know his thoughts from a very deep academic perspective as to what he thought. And we started the entire discussion getting to know him and his previous areas of research. It turned out he's done research before in HIV and AIDS related work. And in the process of that discussion, he mentioned the former president of the Republic of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki. And Thabo Mbeki is a very intellectual and cerebral individual, very, very smart man who took over from the legendary Nelson Mandela. And however, his legacy seemed a bit tainted by some sort of outlandish views, if I may say, with respect, of course, some outlandish views he had on the subject of HIV and AIDS. And so in discussing this, he mentioned Dr. Mbeki, and I could not resist. I had to ask him what he thought about Mbeki's views on HIV and AIDS. And if you don't know what Mbeki thought about HIV and AIDS, here's just a clip to catch you up.
You see, when you ask the question, does HIV cause AIDS? The question is, does a virus cause a syndrome? How does a virus cause a syndrome? It can't. It really, truly, it's necessary. I've been saying to the honorable members, to the people in this country, it's necessary for people to study this question.
Okay, now we've got that. But before we go into his thoughts on Mbeki and AIDS and the rest of the podcast, just a quick message from our sponsors, the Nigeria Stock Exchange. Did you know that the Nigerian entire economy has a stock market to GDP ratio of 8%? For comparison, in the United States it's 170%, in South Africa it's 270%. The stock market to GDP ratio is the capitalization of the stock market relative to the gross domestic product of any country, and Nigeria's is 8%, in the US is 170%. Savvy investors like Warren Buffett and Ray Dalio use this metric to understand assets that are undervalued and invest there. So if you're looking to invest in Africa, the Nigeria Stock Exchange is one of the best gateways you can use to invest in the largest market in Africa, 180 million people and counting. Back to Professor Sakumzi and his take on President Thabo Mbeki and President Thabo Mbeki's views on HIV and AIDS. There you go.
Well, I still remember the original letter that he wrote to presidents of the world,
yes,
including Bill Clinton. Was it Bill Clinton?
Yes.
And as well as the Labour. the Minister of Labour, Tony Blair.
Yes.
No, it was not Bill Clinton. It was actually Bush. I think it was
Bush the second.
Bush the second. I still remember that letter because what he was raising in that letter were issues around the silencing of a certain group of scientists, which became known in public discourse as dissidents. So in that letter, he was raising concern around their silencing, because what these scholars will basically say is that there is no direct relationship between having HIV and developing AIDS. And they were basically arguing that AIDS is more a consequence of poverty than just having HIV. And his concern was that the silencing of these people, for him, is in resonance with the silencing of black people that has happened in South Africa in the apartheid period. And because of that, he wanted to understand why is it that poverty, which is such a big factor in South Africa and Africa right now, why is it not being given as much priority as medical intervention, for example? Why is it that those who are making a case for poverty are being sidelined, right? In that letter, that's really what he was saying initially. But then, as time developed, he began to dig deeper and also question the efficacy of ARVs, or even the medical, the medicines that were meant to protect the children from being infected by their pregnant mothers. He went on to do that, and all of that became intertwined now with his entire discourse around African Renaissance, liberation of Africa. So it became a politicized thing for him, whereby he started to see this entire conglomeration of medical scientists, pharmaceutical companies, researchers, and everybody else as being in cahoots somehow to undermine Africa and the knowledge that comes out of Africa. But most importantly, he also began to raise suspicions that what is actually happening here is that the discourse about Africa as a dark continent and as a repository of all that is dirty is being somehow reproduced
in the HIV
in the HIV discourse, in the manner that now leads into them saying that we need to give them drugs because they cannot control their sexuality. So all the other means that are used to intervene in the West, because the West are seen to be more reasonable, are not being used here. Here, because Africans cannot control their sexuality, therefore they must be tamed in ways that are medical. So it became more about him being opposed to how Africa was being insulted. But I think there was also, another side of it, which was the media take on it, which is about whether or not he believes that HIV caused AIDS, and his stance was that that is subject to debate, that there has not been an evidence that a virus causes a collapse of the entire human system. Especially the intervening issue of poverty, in his view, was not being addressed adequately. But of course, media and other scholars I guess they are entitled to interpreting in their own ways. Yes. But I think, one can say that he took it to the extreme. My position around Thabo Mbeki was that he raised a lot of issues that resonate with our field of medical anthropology.
Yes.
Because in medical anthropology, that is really what we had been saying before, even before Mbeki. There's a subfield that is called critical medical anthropology, whereby we see health as not just a consequence of lack of knowledge, or health and disease is not just a consequence of lack of knowledge, ignorance and whatever, but as being mediated a lot by socio-economic circumstances, and poverty being one of them. But in that discourse also, people do not deny that HIV exists and that it can contribute to lack of immunity and other things. So there was a sense in which I think he was raising the right questions, but I guess as a president of a country with so much, at the time AIDS it looked like it's going to destroy this country. it looked like it's going to wipe out the population somehow. And I think the most responsible thing at that time was to really, of course, raise academic debate, but acknowledge and be seen to be sensitive to those who were being impacted. And many people felt that he was not being sensitive. He was more into intellectual debates rather than dealing with those who are actually affected.